The best managers in the world aren't the experts. They're the ones who know how to make the experts work together. To be able to do that, you've got to have a really broad understanding of what matters to the business, what matters in the world, etc.
Your first role, sort of after you graduated, from what I could see on your resume, was probably one of the most fascinating roles I think I've ever seen on a resume.
My team and myself spent a lot of time, driving around in convoys, flying in helicopters all around those areas, sometimes getting shot at. Most of the time not. So it was, a little bit like sailing, 99% boring and 1%, scary as hell. I think in most teams, if you can find common purpose and a common goal, then what you do is you rally around that.
I'm going to put these cards out here. I'm going to ask you to pick 3 at random.
3 at random?
Yeah, just pick 3 at random.
1, 2, 3. There you go.
And then flip them over, read the card, and tell us your answer.
Okay, what have we got? Lightning round. What are the first 3 things you check when you start your day? That's a good question.
Today, we are pleased to welcome Leigh Berrell, a transformational tech leader dedicated to helping companies to deliver positive change. With nearly 3 decades of experience spanning technology, engineering, transportation, logistics, retail, utilities, and staffing services, Leigh has made significant contributions across various sectors. His career highlights include pivotal roles at organisations such as the United Nations, P&O, Skilled Group, Yarra Valley Water, Bapcor, Air Services, and most recently, the National Archives of Australia. In recognition of his outstanding work, Leigh was named Australian Utilities CIO of the Year in 2013 and was ranked 7th in the 2016 Australian CIO50. Alrighty, so Leigh, thank you for joining me today.
Pleasure, Anton.
So I've been reading through your LinkedIn profile, been going through your resume, and I think really what stood out for me was your breadth of experience. And I think I'm really interested today to sort of dig into that and learn a bit more about your journey.
Yep.
But we're going to go back in time and go back to sort of young Leigh coming out of high school. And it looks like you went into the Navy.
Yeah, I don't know if I can remember back that far. Yeah, no, I did. I always had. I remember when I was a very, very young kid. I don't know exactly how old, but we're talking 5, 6. There was a U.S. fleet. This would have been during the Vietnam War, right? And the U.S. fleet came into Sydney Harbour, and my mother took me down to walk through some of the ships. They had an open day.
Yep.
And I remember walking on these things and thinking, I've got to be in one of these things one day.
Right.
And then sort of other things happened in my childhood, and I sort of forgot that dream a little bit. But when I was in what was then called fourth form, but is now year 10, some Navy recruiters came out to the school I was at. I don't know if they still do that, but it was pretty popular back in the 70s. And they sort of put forward this idea that I could join the Navy straight out of school, not do my HSC in school, but do it in the Navy. And then they put me through university and I could become an engineer. And I thought, what a fantastic idea, right? So I ended up joining the Navy when I was 15 and going to the Naval College in Jervis Bay and spending 2 years there finishing high school, but as a naval officer under training, and then the first year of university down at the Naval College in Jervis Bay in New South Wales. And then after that, went up to Sydney to HMAS Watson, which is right on the south head of Sydney. It couldn't be in a more picturesque place, and lived there for a while I was supposed to finish my engineering degree, but never finished that.
Yeah, it's because you effectively left home at 15.
Pretty much, yep.
Yeah, because that must have taken a fair bit of sort of resilience and character.
Yeah, I'd had a couple of sort of early upsets in my life. I'd sort of been orphaned and then adopted by my uncle and auntie, so I was sort of used to being on my own a little bit. So whilst I had a fantastic, loving family there, I wasn't sort of embedded like a kid who'd been born there and lived there for 15 years. So for me, it was a grand adventure to go off and do this, and a really good opportunity, I thought, at the time.
Absolutely. Absolutely. And I think from sort of looking through that, you see you sort of you lost your love for engineering about 2.5 years into.
Yeah, well, I think the problem was it was also mixed up with my love for the Navy, right? So I had this, and I think a lot of people go into things with an idealized view of the world, right? So I went in with an idealized view of what the Navy was, and pretty quickly learned that it wasn't actually as spectacular as I thought it was going to be. However, a lot of my friends stayed until they were admirals, right? So I know a lot of people who made a career out of it, but wrapped up with that was the engineering side of things, and I realized I didn't actually want to be an electrical engineer after 2.5 years of engineering at university. I just thought that's not exactly what I want to do. So those two things together meant that I was a bit disgruntled and looking for a change, and I think I'd been a bit of a pest to the Navy at the time as well. I probably wasn't their best example of a fine young officer, and I think it was a mutual agreement that I should leave the Navy. And where I actually jumped to was what I realized was that computing wasn't called IT back then. It was data processing or whatever. But computing was actually starting to come out of these sort of cavernous computer rooms and starting to make a presence. You'd walk into a bank and you'd have a passbook printer instead of someone writing in your passbook. There were ATMs around the place, and computing was becoming a thing. So I actually went and jumped into a role which was a technical, sort of a field technician type role with a company called Burroughs at the time, which was huge, absolutely huge, like second to IBM in the world. And sort of started to forge a career in IT.
Yeah, right.
I didn't realize that at the time. I just jumped into that because it looked like a cool thing to do. But it ended up being a really good foundation for an IT career. So.
Yeah, right. That's interesting. Because when I looked at your resume, there was a period of about 12 or 13 years that kind of described various IT jobs. And I was just interested, was that always with Burroughs, or did you kind of move around?
No, so I think what everyone found during the 1980s, because that was that sort of period, that the only way you could really get ahead was by actually moving to a different company at the time. Okay. So you spend 2 years in the place, learn something, jump to the next place, learn something else, jump to the next place. So I sort of rode the wave of technology exploding during that period of time. So my first couple of years was with a mainframe company that was starting to lose its way, right? But I learned a lot about computing in that. Then I jumped to a company that was selling PCs, because PCs had just become a thing, right? They didn't exist when I was working for Burroughs, but suddenly they existed. So I worked for a company that was reselling PCs and started to learn that. And then networking came along. So I started to train myself in that, became a bit of an expert in early networking, and then jumped into another company that was looking for a network engineer. Then ended up going to another US sort of multinational called Wang, which was looking for someone that understood networks. So I became their sort of network guru in Australia. So my career sort of pushed me down the network engineering path, I suppose. Wang went bankrupt in 1990 because basically they didn't understand what PCs were going to do to their market. I ended up jumping to another big US multinational called Digital, and by that time I'd gone through probably 6 iterations. That was the various roles, I suppose. But I'd moved from someone who was pulling out screwdrivers and soldering irons to fix things through to someone who was designing networks and project managing very large network implementations. So I'd learned a lot through that path, but all of it with a really strong technical focus.
Yeah, it's interesting. So almost the evolution of technology kind of matched the evolution of your career.
Yeah, well, there was it was a great time to be alive in IT. So there was, the thing that really happened was, prior to about 1985, all the computer businesses pretty much just operated in their own little vacuum. They were all islands. Had IBM systems and they spoke to each other, and Wang systems or Data General or Digital or whatever, and they just all spoke to each other but not to anything else. And the vendors had really strong control of the world in those days. But then this concept of integration and interconnection came along, and there was sort of two competing, call them standards if you like, or technologies. One of them was an international standard called OSI, Open Systems Integration. Another one was what eventually won, which was a dumbed down version of that called TCP/IP, which was sort of pushed by ARPANET in the US. Those two were competing. So I actually jumped onto the one that I thought was going to win, which was the OSI bandwagon. became the sort of Australian expert in that for Wang. Learned something else, which I'll come back to in a sec, about Australians versus Americans through this process too. But then when that didn't actually go ahead like it was supposed to, I then changed horses very quickly and learned TCP/IP. But it was amazing to see. You could actually feel, it was palpable, the change that was happening in IT at the time. And you could actually see how it was going to change the world as all these things interconnected. And I wanted to be part of that at the time. It was a lot of fun.
Yeah, it's incredible. Yeah. How were you identifying or those opportunities, or how were they identifying you? Because there was no LinkedIn, there's no job boards.
No.
It was newspaper ads, right?
I think there was newspaper ads. I mean, you spent a lot of time doing, looking through those ads if you were looking to jump. But typically you sort of had a view. There were a lot of magazines around, and there were a lot of news articles on who was doing what. And if you really wanted to be at the bleeding edge of something, you got a pretty good understanding pretty quickly of who was leading that, and so you went and marketed yourself to them. Or just looked for opportunities with that organisation. Most of the American organizations at the time were very strong on training and very strong on development, those big American IT companies. And so you couldn't really go wrong going into one or the other of those. In the end, I ended up working for 4 of them. So,
Through that period, and we talked about this earlier, but through that period, you kind of formalized your education in tech. With a degree at University of New South Wales Technology.
So after a few years out of the Navy and having not finished my first shot at an undergraduate degree, I sort of came to a conclusion that whilst I didn't need it right now, at some stage in the future, it'd probably be a useful thing to have a degree. So what I ended up doing was going to what's now UTS in Sydney, and did a degree in computer science, a bachelor's degree in computer science, part-time with them, which took close on 8 years to finish because I was always a bit distracted by my career at the time. But it was definitely worthwhile doing because I was sort of focused on one aspect of technology, and it made me realize that the other aspects of technology, I was just a networks guy, but there was programming and there were databases and there was everything else, and it gave me a bit of a view of that. So I didn't completely lose track of all the other things that were important. And I think that's been really beneficial. So whether I got anything directly valuable out of that degree, I'm not sure, but I got a lot of indirect value out of it.
It sounds like it was filling in the gaps, as in you've kind of developed this hands-on experience of working in tech, but there's probably a bit of theory over here, and there's other domains that you've not had the same exposure, but it's the ability to maybe be able to see the whole picture.
I think it's really important. So one of the things I see it even now, right, is people end up getting cocooned into the thing that they're good at or the thing that they're interested in, and they lose track of the fact that there's a whole bunch of other things going on around them that are equally as important or maybe more important, right? So just because you're good at something doesn't mean it's the most important thing. And I think it's really important, and as I've gone through my career, I've made more and more of an effort of understanding all the other considerations around me. Maybe at some point to the detriment of the thing that I'm working on myself. You almost have to push yourself out there and do other things and put them at the front of your interest rather than the thing that you've latched onto.
It's interesting. We've had a number of guests recommend a book called Range by a guy called David Epstein. And the subtitle for that book is Being a Generalist in the World of Specialization. And he makes the argument for exactly what you've just articulated, the importance of not being just wedded in one domain, but being able to see everything around the edges. And that's kind of where innovation and new idea generation and probably successful outcomes come from.
Well, I think certainly as you ascend the management ladder, right? You've got to drop that specialization because there are very few good managers that are specialists unless what they are doing is managing a team of specialists. But if you actually want to get to a position where you're a strategic manager, you almost have to drop the ego of being the expert in the room on something and allow other people to be the experts in the room. The best managers in the world aren't the experts. They're the ones who know how to make the experts work together. And I think to be able to do that, you've got to have a really broad understanding of what matters to the business, what matters in the world, etc.
Again, I think you make a great point. It's interesting as you were saying that, I was reflecting, if you look at the world of sport, often someone that's been a player in sport that goes into manage a sports team, if they're a defender, the team probably doesn't concede many points.
Yep.
And if they're an attacker, they probably play with lots of flair, and as in they kind of continue with their specialization into management, certainly initially, until they kind of find their way. Your first role, sort of after you graduated, from what I could see on your resume, was probably one of the most fascinating roles I think I've ever seen on a resume, and that was a role with the United Nations, going into the former Yugoslavia, which had only just become the former Yugoslavia, I'd imagine at that point.
Yeah, so it was probably 3 years into being the former Yugoslavia. Well, it was actually Yugoslavia, but it was in the process of breaking apart, was probably a better way of putting it. So I was at a point in my life, I guess, where from a personal perspective, I was looking for a little bit of an escape. I just finished a really very big job working at Digital and wasn't sure what my next big job with them was, a huge project, and I didn't want to do another big project with them. And an opportunity came along through someone that I know that was still in the defence area. They said that they're looking basically for someone to manage the network in the former Yugoslavia. Would you be interested? I sort of said yes, and sent in my resume to the address, mailed in my resume to the address as you did at the time, and heard nothing more until one morning I got a phone call about 3 o'clock in the morning from Carol Damiano, who I got to know very well. And Carol said, "Well, you're ready to go? Are you packed?" And I said, "What are you talking about? Who are you?" And it turned out that somehow they missed the part where they were supposed to interview me and make sure I actually wanted to do the job and that I could do the job. And they'd just gone from resume and recommendation. And they just missed a whole bunch of steps, as in telling me that I had a job with the United Nations and wanted me to get on a plane like that week and go over there. So I had to sort of say, look, it'll take me longer than a week to get my life together and jump and get over there. But about 3 weeks later, I was on a plane to Zagreb in Croatia.
Yeah.
Really interesting role. I had no idea what to expect, and it was a war zone, a very active war zone at the time. Croatia was sort of Zagreb in Croatia was on the fringe of it, where the UN headquarters was. My job was to run a team of 10 to 12 people, whose role was basically to expand the IT network that the UN ran throughout the former Yugoslavia, out to all of what they call the sectors, the various war zone areas, the headquarters for each of these smaller areas. And that involved basically building some servers and going out there and installing those and putting up a satellite dish and getting that communication happening. In a lot of cases, finding someone local, either a soldier or a local who lived in the area, to administer that, and then coming back to Zagreb and going to the next one. So my team and myself spent a lot of time, driving around in convoys, flying in helicopters all around those areas, sometimes getting shot at. Most of the time not. So it was, a little bit like sailing, 99% boring and 1%, scary as hell. But it was a really interesting job. I learned a lot from it because it was actually my first real management job, where I had a team that I was actively managing, and it was a really multicultural team. I had a guy from Zimbabwe, a guy from Colombia, a Mexican, a Norwegian, a guy from Laos, a couple of other Australians in there. There was a New Zealander in there, a Serb and a Croat who both lived in there, who actually got on very well. It was just a very multicultural team with really different backgrounds. There was a guy there, Daniel, who was I was in my 30s at the time. He was 55 and he'd been retrenched from IBM in France and was looking for a job just to pay his family. So he'd gone across there, but he was absolutely brilliant. Ranga from Zimbabwe that I worked with really closely was probably the smartest guy I've ever met in my life.
Yeah.
Just absolutely brilliant.
You talked earlier about how the job of a manager is to bring a team together, not to be the specialist.
Yep.
Your first leadership role, pretty difficult conditions
as
well.
This one probably I had to remain a little bit the specialist because it was all about getting a network built, and my background was all about building networks. So I maintained a lot of the specialization, but I also had to learn, how do I get the most out of these people? How do I how do I build a really high-performing team out of a bunch of people who have all come from all different parts of the world and have a different worldview to each other, to me. And we're in a circumstance that isn't like your normal office.
That's
it's
right.
not a 9 to 5 thing where you go home at the end of the day. It is actually, a pressure job, or parts of it were a pressure job. And so I learned on the spot, I suppose. A lot of it was just working out what worked, what didn't. There are a number of other people over there that could act as mentors. Some of the more senior managers in the IT. There are a lot of Australians and a lot of Americans, as you can imagine, in that cohort. Some of the Australians were fantastic, more senior to me, and were able to give me a lot of pointers and a bit of guidance here and there, and occasionally tap me on the shoulder and suggest an alternate way of doing things.
Yeah.
But it was a really good learning experience for me, and a great life experience as well.
Yeah, fantastic. I can imagine, I guess, in the pressure of the situation or the circumstances, that can also help pull a team together, because you're all kind of in it together, even though you're from different parts of the world. But how did you find that common ground?
That's a good question. I think we were all there for a purpose, and everyone was there for the job, but everyone was there for the outcome that they were looking for. So we actually had, I think in most teams, if you can find common purpose and a common goal, then what you do is you rally around that. And our common goal was actually to support the 40,000 soldiers who were trying to stop a war that was killing tens of thousands of people in that area. And so, we all did our very best, I guess, to set up all the communications and the technology they needed to be able to do that job. Because what our thing was about was not so the soldiers could communicate with each other, it's so that the logistics could operate in the area. Soldiers need toilet paper and food and everything too. So in order to get that stuff, they have to order it, and if you don't have a means of communications, that becomes really difficult to manage. So what we were doing was basically building the infrastructure that allowed those, they say an army marches on a stomach. Well, we allowed them to fill those stomachs and keep people marching, basically.
So that's interesting. I did, when I looked at your resume, I didn't necessarily make that connection, but your next role from there, you went to P&O Ports, where you spent, I think, 11 years, and went from a technology role all the way through to CEO of one of the business operations. But there's, I guess, a consistent theme there of logistics and movement in some ways. But I didn't make that connection when I first kind of read it. I thought, how do you go from the UN to P&O?
Well, I guess that's actually a pretty easy connection. I came back from the UN, back to Sydney, and thought, well, what do I do now? Because that was a pretty exciting year and a bit. Right? And I was still looking for something that had an element of excitement and action about it. And I ended up getting a contract role with a bank, which was probably about the most boring thing. It was actually two banks or two financial organizations that were merging at the time. And they were looking for someone to help guide how do we merge our networks and merge our computer rooms and all that type of stuff. So I ended up becoming a cog in the wheel, reasonably big cog, but a cog in the wheel of that exercise. And after a couple of months of that, I just couldn't take it anymore. And I saw a job advertised, again in the paper, from P&O Ports, and everyone knows P&O, but from the shipping side, the cruise ship side of things, I hadn't really thought about it as being a logistics operator at the time. But they were looking for an international IT manager, and what this role was posited as is P&O were going to be expanding globally and building all these container terminals and car terminals and things, shipping terminals all around the world, and they needed someone to help drive the expansion of their technology to do that. I thought to myself, that sounds like lots of travel to places that people typically don't go for holidays, so that sounds good, so I'll have a shot at that. So I applied for it and got the job, and that was pretty much exactly what it was.
Is P&O, perhaps I've got my wires crossed on this, is there an Australian company? I'm trying to understand how that role ended up being run out of Australia.
No, that's a good question. P&O is actually a UK company, or was a UK company, that was founded during Queen Victoria's time by royal decree. So it was actually created to carry goods between England and India during the time. and the mail and everything else, right? So it actually was one of a few companies over there that operate under Royal Charter as opposed to operating under corporate law, which is an interesting distinction. So a few things applied and didn't apply, depending on how you looked at it. But P&O Ports, P&O had done very well in ports development in Australia, and so they'd moved the headquarters for their ports subdivision to Australia. So that's why I was operating out of Sydney, not operating out of London. But I ended up spending a lot of time in London because, we went back there for reporting. And
my hometown in the UK is Southampton, which I'm pretty confident is the head office of P&O, and a lot of it was around.
Certainly it's one of the bigger terminals. Is their head office was in Pall Mall in London, right? And one of those very old buildings with a butler and a doorman, that doffed his hat as you walked in. Very old world. But Southampton has a huge car and container terminal there that they operate. And there are other ports around. By the time I left P&O, there were like 36 ports around the world that they were operating.
Because through that time, you ended up being seconded to the US as well in one of the roles, and I think to set up the US operations. But there's a couple of questions I had on that. The first one was through your travels, I guess, through P&O. Let's talk about the US maybe to start with. What did you notice as a difference between US and Australian culture?
I sort of alluded to this earlier, actually, and it played out again. It had played out earlier in my life and played out again later. But one of the things that I found, I don't know if it's still true in the US, but it certainly was in the 80s, and it was certainly there in the late 90s, was Americans like to do things by the book. Right? They like to follow the rules, and they don't actually work in a very ad hoc manner. So if, for example, two companies want to talk to each other, the first thing they'll do is they'll write a letter to each other, and then they'll set up a meeting and they'll come in and talk. Australians approach things as pick up the phone and say, mate, we need to have a conversation, let's meet down the pub sort of thing, and we'll take it from there. But that very laissez-faire attitude that Australians has actually cuts through a lot of the red tape that the Americans create as it's like they create their own bureaucracy, and their own red tape. And in doing so, they slow things down. So going back to the time that I was working in the technology companies, one of the things that we did very well in Australia, and they were still struggling to do in the head offices in the US, was do a bunch of interoperability testing between various computer companies, IBM, Digital, Wang, all those, needed to test all this new software and new systems and make them work. And we'd sort of, been shipped out this new software from R&D and told, go off and do this, and let us know when you've done it. And, I picked up the phone and said, who's looking after this over at Digital? And, I get a guy called Mark Barron on the other end, and we said, right, let's set up a test tomorrow. We get it done. And then we talk to our counterpart at IBM. And by the end of the week, we've tested it, And we ring them up and we said, what do you mean I ring up my counterpart, what do you mean you've tested it? How could you have tested it? I just rang them up and we got it done. And they said, well, we're still waiting for a response on the letter, So I ended up getting sort of seconded across to Wang in the US to run their interoperability lab because we just didn't follow the rules in the same way, and it sped things up. But what I found was the same thing when I went across there with P&O. We tended not to follow the rules. We tended to sort of circumvent them or shortcut them. So we got things done a lot more quickly than the Americans would typically get things done. Yeah. And I think, I don't think you would have got away with it if you had an American accent, but the Australian accent really gave you a little bit of leeway. Plus it was sort of, Crocodile Dundee time in the world, they sort of understood that we're a bit like that, so they allowed it to go. But it's actually a really good tool, right? To be able to bypass all of the formalities and just get things done.
I think there's a time when you can play to your cultural stereotype to get things done. I can confirm, actually, it's a few years ago now, but just before I came to Australia, I'd spent some time living in Texas. And when I came to Australia, I had to unlearn that formality that I got used to do business in terms of your credentials and what you'd done. And previously, people really wanted to validate who you were, whereas I got here and first thing people want to do is go for a beer, go for a coffee, get to know you on a personal level and kind of cut through that stuff. So it took a bit of time to unlearn it, I would say.
That role in the US was a really interesting one for me. So before that, I'd been what you might call a serial IT manager. So what would happen is P&O would decide they wanted to build a container terminal in Mumbai, right? So they would go and buy the land, and they get into typically a joint venture with another company or with the government, public-private partnership type thing. But they would need some IT systems set up. So I would fly in there, talk to the vendors, buy the IT kit, talk with the US software provider, set up an IT team, get it sort of 50% done, and then I'd fly off to the next place while the new IT manager sort of built them up. And so I was flitting backwards and forwards between 3 or 4 places at a time, just constantly in the air, sort of flying around. I had Pakistan, Sri Lanka, and India on the go at one stage, and was just doing the triangle between them, which raised a few eyebrows at immigration as you're flying backwards and forwards between those 3 countries. But it was really tiring. I was getting to the point where, I worked out one day when I was sitting in a plane, I went through my passport and I worked out I'd spent 3 days at home in Australia during the whole of 1998. So I was sort of getting really tired of that travel, and that was the time that P&O bought into North America. They decided to really make a big investment. They went in, they bought a stevedoring company, and they bought a series of stevedoring companies very quickly. 4 companies in the end that hated each other because they'd been solid competitors and suddenly were under the same umbrella. And that informality of the management team that came in, I think helped to break down some of that malice that existed between those companies. We got them talking to each other at a personal level as opposed to at a business competitor level, and that I think was one of the things I learnt about differences in culture. The other thing I learned is the Mason-Dixon line, that north-south divider in the US, is still, it may as well be drawn on the map. It is there and it is solid, and no one down south trusts the Yankees, and no one up north trusts the people in the south. It is really a very interesting place. Culturally, it is a really odd place, the US, I think.
Well, it's so broad, so diverse, but so insular at the same time.
It's like 100 countries forced into one, and they just, the Californians are so different to the New Yorkers, who are so different from the Cubans in Miami, who are so different to the Texans, who are so different from the people in Nebraska. They are just all really, really different.
Yes, absolutely. I saw through that time as well that you were there during 9/11.
Yes.
And I think I even read that on your resume that you had operations in New York and Newark maybe through that. So how did that kind of impact you, and kind of what did that mean?
So probably it could have impacted me a lot worse, actually. I was very lucky in that P&O had decided to have an IT managers conference in Mumbai. Effectively the same day that 9/11 was happened. And so I'd actually sent my wife and then very young daughter, a few months old, she'd only just been born, down to Argentina to my wife's place because I was flying off to India, and then after that I was going back to Australia for something, and then to the UK, and then back to the US. So I'd sort of flown out the night before, and I was landing in India about the time 9/11 happened. So I missed the event itself, but I had to sort of rush back into the US afterwards as quickly as I could get back there, just because I was on the executive of 3 of the operations in the port there. But the reason it actually probably saved me that trip is because I was going off to India, and a couple of other. I used to be on the security committee for the port because I was the CIO of 3 of the terminals in the port. And we used to meet every second Tuesday in Tower 1. And we would have actually been having a meeting that morning, but that meeting was actually called off because so many people were going to be absent. And the people that we'd normally meet with who worked for the Port Authority in that building decided to take the opportunity to go out to one of the ports and not be in the building that morning. So it probably saved them as well.
Wow.
But it really, you could see the dent in the American psyche afterwards. I mean, it was a an incredibly impactful thing for the US. They realized just how vulnerable they were, I think, and you could see that just the whole mentality of the place changed overnight. So I got back in there on the following Saturday, was when I got back there. But that was a very, very badly bruised country after that for a long time. And I don't think they've actually recovered from it.
No, it's still definitely a feature, I think, and you expect it to be. It's so significant, particularly on the East Coast, I think.
But I used to live in an apartment in Jersey City, which is directly across the Hudson River from where the World Trade Center stood, and I could stand on my balcony and see the Statue of Liberty just there, and the World Trade Center just there, and it's very strange. I can tell you, coming back into the country and not seeing the World Trade Center.
Yeah, I can imagine.
Yeah, it's just it literally left a hole in America.
Yes. Yeah, absolutely.
And philosophically left a hole in America as well. So,
After that role, you then went from tech into being a CEO for I think it's satellite telemetry.
Yeah, so it was actually a sub company of P&O still, so it was still part of the P&O world. What had happened was my engineering counterpart had actually bought a small business which had some really nifty technology, but hadn't really worked out how to turn it into something that was like a product. Yeah. Right? And I ended up going in and running that for a few years and taking the very nifty technology that they had and working with some really smart people in Australia and actually over in the Ukraine, some developers over there, and we wrote some fantastic software that sort of wrapped this up into a container terminal management package. You would now call it Internet of Things, but in the day it was just sensors that we put into vehicles. Right? But it was a sort of an early Internet of Things type implementation. And we were selling that both within the P&O world, but also selling it to competitors. So I was, very proud when I ended up selling it to the biggest container terminals on the East Coast and the West Coast of the US, both of whom were not P&O. Yeah, they were in direct competition with P&O, but our job was actually to go and sell the product, regardless of who the recipient was. That all sort of changed though, because what happened was around the 2006 timeframe. The Emir of Dubai, or one of the Emirs of Dubai, it's called Emirates for a reason, but one of the Emirs decided to invest by purchasing P&O outright. It was listed on the UK Stock Exchange, but he offered some enormous amount of money, and basically delisted it and purchased the company outright, and it became the company shifted to become DP World, Dubai Ports World, and it's still DP World today, but it changed the culture of the organization, and a little sort of, I suppose this minuscule little thing called Satel that existed in there didn't have much of a future in that organization. So at that point I decided that was probably I'd been there long enough, and it was time for me to move. And that company was eventually on-sold to a German RFID company that purchased it.
Yeah, okay. Because I was going to ask you, after a decade or so with an organization, it's a tough decision to move on. But it sounds like there was some manoeuvring there with the kind of structure of the organisation that just didn't align with you anymore.
Yeah, I think one of the problems was that they had a very centralist view in that they wanted all of the management team of all of the businesses to spend a lot of time in Dubai, and I had they were sort of looking for me to maybe move over there, and whilst it's a great place to have a stopover on the way to Europe, it wasn't a place I wanted to raise my two daughters. So, so that sort of played into it as well. But it was just time to move on. Sometimes it's time to move.
Yeah, look, absolutely. And I think you look at that decade of your life. You've travelled the world. You've met your wife. You've had kids, and there's a lot going on through that period as well.
Yep.
And then so you then joined Skill Group.
Yeah. So I came in there actually as a sort of an enterprise architect, 2IC to the CIO.
Yeah.
One of the reasons I actually went to Skill Group, or one of the reasons they hired me, is because at the time they were looking to do a lot of global expansion. So they were looking to expand into North America in particular, and they wanted someone who had experience of operating in North America. Yeah. And I had that because I'd been over there for 2.5 years acting as a CIO. And so it was like a perfect match. But what Skill Group did was basically a provision of contingent labour, right? 50,000 people a day out there working in factories and offices and doing things, as contractors and consultants. And then the GFC hit. Right? So I joined and the GFC hit, and Skilled went from this sort of upward trajectory to, the first thing every business drops as soon as it gets under pressure is contingent labour. So we went, as an organisation, we went from having 50,000 people placed a day to 10,000 people placed a day in a very quick time. But we still had the core that operated the business, the 3,500 people who operated the business, that you couldn't just slice that off at the same rate that we were losing. Those workers were our inventory, basically. We were losing the inventory, losing sales, but we couldn't lose the centre. So that job actually shifted from being something that could have been spectacular in terms of a growth trajectory to shrinking ourselves to greatness. Really, it was trying to actually just keep the company alive for a number of years.
Yeah, right. So that was in terms of optimizing the technology platforms they were using.
If by optimize you mean taking cost out, yes. Yeah. So they had actually invested quite well, and they put a new ERP system in place, and they hadn't even finished when the GFC hit. So part of it was trying to finish off that job, but it was really about how do I take something that had been on a very quick upward trajectory and turn it around into something where we start to actually chisel people out of the organisation very quickly, but don't destroy the organisation at the same time. So that was the first time I'd ever had to do that at that level. I mean, I've had to go into places before and say, okay, well, we need to get rid of 5% of people, but not 50% of people, right? Yeah. So for me, it was a really good learning exercise. I learned that I don't like that environment, and I don't think anyone does. I think actually if you're a person who likes working in that environment, then you're probably not a lot of fun at parties. But I think it helped me to understand what's valuable to a business, right? And to work out, where do you draw the line of what do you hold on to and retain, even though it's difficult, right? And what can you let go? And to an extent, who can you let go? What skill sets do you let go? But there's nothing pleasant about being in that environment.
No way. I was listening to an interview with the CEO for Airbnb a few weeks ago, and reflecting on when COVID hit, and they were on the cusp of probably one of the biggest IPOs in the world, or in history, sorry. To 8 weeks later, they lost, in a period of 8 weeks, they lost 80% of their revenue. Yeah. And they had to make a couple of thousand redundancies. I forget the exact number, but it was big. But the advice that he said that he got at the time was cut deeper than you think you probably need to, because you don't want to do this twice.
Yep.
And it's easier to kind of cut too deep and then come back up than it is to go too shallow and then go again, because you will destroy your culture. Yeah. And I thought that was really interesting advice. I mean, how did that kind of play out in your situation?
Yeah, so I wish I would have had that advice at the time. I think, I tried to do what most people would do, is to try and take the softest possible path to start with, and realize that you weren't pushing hard enough, and so you go a little harder and a little harder. But you're right. I mean, it's like dragging out the operation. Sometimes it's better to just actually slice off the limb. And I think that advice, I would offer that advice again now, is probably go hard, go quickly. Yeah. Right? And I think people mostly realize that it's not personal, right? But look after the people that you're letting go. Right? Make sure they're looked after. That's very important, because the people that are staying are going to see how you treated those people that you let go, and that's going to dictate what the culture looks like after they're gone.
Look, absolutely. Yeah. Again, I remember somebody saying this to me very early in my career, which is society is judged by how it manages its prisoners and elderly. Yep. Right, as in how civilized you are, but also the people that resign or are leaving your business. Yep. And it's very easy to kind of treat them offhanded. And actually, to go full circle there with the Airbnb story, they actually turned their talent acquisition team into talent placement, and they focused on everyone they made redundant, trying to place them into their next job.
Okay, that's pretty cool.
As a mechanism to try and support those people, they extended their healthcare for 12 months, which obviously in the US is a big thing, and a multitude of other things. But they actually turned their energy on helping the people that they were going to have to let go. Yep. It was a great story. Again, I can't think where I heard it now, but it was just some interesting lessons to learn from that experience.
So the reality was, though, at the end of the day, I ended up being made redundant from that position as well.
Right, there you go.
In a very interesting way, but I won't go into the details. But it was probably not. Yeah, it was probably not a lesson in how to treat people well. But I was sort of ready for it and prepared for it because it was obvious it was going to happen. So I had already started sniffing around for other opportunities at the time and was lucky to actually land in one almost immediately.
Because I saw that said after that you went to Yarra Water.
Yep.
And when I spoke at the start of the podcast about the breadth of experiences, I was kind of noting these as I was going through your resume. And I was looking at your career and I was going like, okay, Navy, Warzone, freight and logistics, recruitment, and now utilities. I was thinking you're building up the whole suite here of industry experiences.
There is, however, a common thread in here in that nearly everywhere I've worked, people wear some form of PPE, right? So, so if you look at it from that,
steel toe cap boots,
so,
you there.
So I haven't worked in finance. I haven't worked in banks. People are typically wearing big boots and hard hats in the places.
You like dangerous environments?
No, I just like environments where you can actually see what's happening in a sort of a physical sense. You can see what they do because it's obvious. It's in front of you. If you're a utility, there's poles and wires, or there's pipes and pumps and dams, and if it's, skill group was probably a bit on the cusp, but, you could actually see the people who were working out there in industry. P&O, you could definitely see what was happening. Ships full of containers moving around, container yards. There's nothing actually more interesting than being in a container yard at full speed, watching all these container handlers spinning around the place. It's incredible, the logistics and just the juggling that goes on in those places.
Yeah, absolutely. And the skill, by the way, those crane operations.
Yeah, that's right. Yeah.
They're not small or light or easy to handle. You spent about 6 years or so, or give or take, in that role there with Yarra Water, which is probably one of your longest single stops.
Yep.
P&O was longer, but you kind of moved around in different roles. I guess what I was interested in, how do you stay fresh over that time frame in a role?
Yeah, so I don't think you do. So part of my belief is that you've got a finite time in any role to get done what you have to get done, because eventually you become part of the problem, not part of the solution, right? But I think what was interesting in that role, it was funny because I jumped into that role. What was in my head at the time that I accepted the job was, this will be a great place to go to for a year until I find a real job, right? But the reality was, I got there and I thought, this is a real job. Almost from day one, I thought, this is actually fantastic. I really like this. I thought that, it's government-owned, safe haven, good place to go. But it was actually really interesting. And what excited me about the place was they really needed to change their approach to technology, and they needed a culture uplift. They'd been formed out of Melbourne Water, sort of, or the Melbourne Metropolitan Board of Works became Melbourne Water, and then it shed out the retailers, right? But everything had always been outsourced in IT there. And what I actually found when I went in there, and this is no disrespect to anyone from Yarra Valley Water who listens to this, but I sort of walked in thinking, what we've got is a team of 30 people here in IT whose job is to complain about the outsourcers, right? As opposed to actually do any work. And the outsourcers did their job as best as they could, based on what we paid them, but it was subpar. We'd had a cut. One of my predecessors had screwed the outsourcer to the wall, so it was just not a great environment, and we needed to lift that environment. If we wanted to move forward, we needed to actually lift our capability, and we couldn't do that in that sort of adversarial outsourcer relationship that we had. And so, but they'd never actually considered that it might be possible to insource. And of course, we're talking here about 2011, right? And outsourcing was flavor of the day at the time. And I went in and said, no, we're going to turn this around and we're going to insource. And so I actually drove a culture change, which is, let's all take responsibility for the systems that we own and operate, and let's build up our own capability and bring people in and get strong engagement back with the business. So, because IT was sort of seen as the people out there that we never talk to, and they never talk to us, and, they do an okay job, I suppose. Right? But we needed to turn that around to, these people are, we needed the business to see us as the lifeblood of what they do, and we needed to see that the business was the reason for our existence.
Yep.
And so I spent years basically working with my management team and working with the executive, turning that around, and we got to a really, really good place in that space.
Yeah, fantastic.
But coming back to what I said about you start to become part of the problem, I've got this pet view. So if you sort of, in fact, I think it's actually sped up, but there used to be a bit of a view that all CIOs spend 4 to 6 years in a role and then they move to the next role, right? Sometimes a little bit shorter, not much longer.
Yeah.
And a few people hang on forever, right? But most people, 5 years was the sort of time you would expect to see a CIO in a role. And I think there's a reason for that. It takes you about 5 years to achieve everything that you set out to accomplish. And then at that point in time, everything needs to be refreshed again, and it's very hard to kill your own children, right?
Yeah.
You've got to you look at this thing you've built, which is just based on everything that you stood for, right? So it is an expression of you, the world 5 years after you joined, and now what you've got to do is tear it down and start again, and that is actually very hard to do. And so human nature will mean that you'll go soft on doing that. You'll try to protect certain things, right? And that's not good for the organization, because what they actually need you to do at that point in time is step out of the way and let someone else come in and rip apart the thing that needs to be rebuilt. So I think one of the reasons that people tend to move in that sort of 5-year cycle, right, is because there's a sort of a natural momentum to do that, because rather than tearing apart what you've built, it's much, much more fun, much easier and much more efficient to go and tear apart something someone else did. Right? And that's why you get this sort of fluid movement going on with CIOs moving between organizations, because it's the best way for technology to progress. A little bit like I was saying way earlier on, you used to jump around between companies to get ahead. Well, it's sort of the same thing. To continue to be impactful, if you go to a new organization, it's much easier to be impactful as the new guy than it is than the guy that's been there for a very long time.
Absolutely.
And I think that sort of played out in my head a little bit at that time. The other thing that sort of played out in my head was, I got tapped on the shoulder by a headhunter at the time who offered a lot more money to me to go and work for another company. And I thought, well, I'd already was thinking that it was probably time to move on, right?
Yeah.
And when that came along, it just sort of cemented the idea.
Yeah, I think what I'm taking away there is almost, when you talk about the definition of insanity, it's you kind of at risk of doing the same thing as well in that role after 5 years and expecting a different result.
Yep.
It needs fresh blood, fresh ideas. Someone to come in and objectively look at something, and it's probably run its course. I think when I did the research a while ago, earlier this year, I think 3.5 years was the average tenure for a CIO, something around that kind of figure, which is probably at the point when they're starting to taper off in terms of you're at the fringe stuff at that point, unless there's suddenly a big new project, new transformation, new investment comes along. Things are going to get a bit stale probably around that time.
Yeah, and I think the job of a CIO really, at the end of the day, is people don't bring in a new CIO because they want everything to be exactly the same.
That's right.
They bring in a new CIO because they think that there's a need for change, right? If not, then that's a fantastic company, but there's very few that don't need to be disrupted in some way. And so the role of a CIO is to come in and disrupt the status quo and to build on it and to change it. And it's very hard to actually disrupt yourself. I mean, if you look at companies that have failed, over the last 30 years, the Kodaks of this world that weren't prepared to be self-disrupting, right? Because it's hard to disrupt yourself, right?
Yeah, very, very challenging.
And it's easy to go in and disrupt someone else's work.
Well, there's self-awareness and self-sabotage, right? Somewhere between those things. And it's interesting because reflecting again on what you're saying there, obviously the job market's quite tight at the moment. The economy's quite tight at the moment, and I think that all goes hand in hand. And companies, particularly in that CIO level market, they're not really investing in transformational change or the growth of their tech capability. It's become a little bit more BAU at the moment. Yep. You've probably got a few disgruntled CIOs that are kind of hanging on.
Possibly. I'd say they're probably just hanging on and thinking about what their next opportunity will be. And and maybe what they're doing is they're looking at smaller, focused opportunities within their organization. Plenty of opportunity at the moment with AI and other technologies to go off and make a bit of a difference. But, probably not fundamental change, right?
That's right.
Anyone I've seen that's actually affected fundamental change has come in from the outside.
That's right.
With a change agenda in place and the backing of the executive and the board.
And that's kind of what we saw post-COVID. We saw there was a big run on CIOs changing jobs. And I think that was as organizations knew that there was going to be a new economic world post-COVID.
Yep. And
they needed change in order to make that happen. Equally, CIOs saw opportunity to go somewhere else to go and fix someone else's problem. And I suspect at some point in the next, 6 months, 9 months, 12 months, I'm not an economist, but as the market improves, we'll see the same movement again. Because there will be opportunity that will kind of come out the back of what we're going through. I also spotted through that time at Yarra Water, and that my assumption was that it was probably one of the first roles you'd had for a number of years where you were probably predominantly home-based.
Yep.
And I saw that you pursued a couple of outside interests in projects. So I saw there was the 100% project around gender inequality, and the Dolphin Research Institute. And I was just interested, how did you get involved in those things, and how did that kind of tick the purpose box for you in terms of what you needed around sort of your purpose and why?
Yeah, so there's probably two parts to the answer. So the first is, what did I get out of it, right?
Yeah.
And what I was looking for was to get an understanding of what it means to be a board director.
Yeah.
Because being an executive is a very different thing. And if I was going to service a company well, I need to understand what the directors are looking for. And I wanted to get a bit of experience and skill at that, because I could see that that's something I might like to do in the future. So I looked for a few not-for-profits that might be interested in having an IT guy on their board. The 100% project was an interesting one because it was about gender equity in management, which I feel very strongly in favour of, right, and always have. And I think it's ridiculous that you would have any thought that someone could or couldn't do a job based on their gender, whichever way it falls. Right?
Yeah.
And that's what I loved about the story behind the 100% project was it was equality between women and men. It wasn't raising women up. It wasn't trying to build quotas. It wasn't doing this. It was, how do we get everyone onto the same level playing field? So I was really interested in that. And what I found was some very different views around the table. Some people who are very strongly for quotas and some people who are very strongly for other approaches, etc. But I learned a lot from that exercise. I also learnt that not-for-profit boards are very different than for-profit business boards, in that not-for-profit boards are effectively slave labour, right? Yeah. Because you end up doing a lot more work than just being on the board. But I enjoyed that immensely. The Dolphin Research thing is because I have a holiday place, beach house or whatever, down on the Mornington Peninsula, and we have this sort of pod of dolphins that lives near there, and I thought, who's looking after these dolphins, and then I noticed there was this Dolphin Research Institute that was advertising for a director, so I joined that and spent a couple of years in there. And what I brought to that wasn't really IT skills, but they needed a little bit more maturity in some of their management focus and some of their practices within the thing. So myself and another guy who joined about the same time, Patrick, who was it was basically an accountant. We spent a bit of time helping them sort of reset the way that they operated their business.
Yeah, great.
A little bit, which was, again,
some
good
great experiences. Going back to the 100% project, based on what you kind of learned through that, if there was an organisation or a business leader listening and was thinking, I really want to make a difference around gender equality in my business, what would be your kind of start point that you'd recommend them? So
probably the first thing that I would say is I went in there with a view that I didn't think quotas was a very good thing. The whole concept of a quota of providing a positive bias towards women to do something. But I sort of left there and subsequently have sort of learned over my career that there is actually a need for a bit of positive bias towards women. So if you have two people that are absolutely equal, pick the woman for the job. Not because they're necessarily going to be better, but because if we are going to try and drive equality, there has to be, women have been sort of forced down for quite some period of time. Yep. So lifting them up is not necessarily a bad thing and giving them a little bit of a head start. I think we're getting closer to gender equality, but we haven't quite got there yet. So a little bit more bias in that direction, I think, is a good thing. But I think that's probably the first thing, is that there is a need for intervention. Right. Yep. And the second thing is that there is a whole raft of different approaches out there, some of which are quite militant in their view and some of which are quite rational in their view. And I'd suggest, try to aim for the rational, not the militant.
Yeah.
Because I think, trying to be too militant can actually sort of work against you in terms of getting your story told.
It damages the story ultimately, doesn't it?
Mm-hmm.
I think is what you're saying. Yeah, that's great. Thank you. Next up for you after Yarra Valley Water,
Yarra Valley Water,
was Bapcor.
Yes.
Another industry pivot into automotive accessories, I think, is that the market, or aftermarket? Aftermarket?
It's automotive aftermarket. So they have roughly about 30 businesses operating under the Bapcor umbrella, some of which are manufacturers, distributors, some of which are wholesalers, some of which are retailers, some of which will fix your car, Midas, ABS, those businesses. But really a warehousing and logistics organisation. That's effectively what it was. But it was going through a phase, it's sort of similar to Skilled in a way. Skilled was actually a big conglomeration of businesses as well. It wasn't just a monolithic business. There were plenty of things under the umbrella. And they were trying to work out how do we actually turn this into an enterprise as opposed to a collection of businesses. Yeah. And they were looking for an IT uplift. They were looking for some direction in that space. Probably not one of my best choices to go into that business because
why say that?
Well, I think you've got to be careful, but basically what I was told the organisation was looking for was different to what the organisation was actually looking for. Yeah. And I'd sort of tweaked to that even before I jumped in there, but I let my ego get in the way, right, and thought I can go in and do some great things in this place. And I found it very difficult because I found working with the executive there very difficult because what they were focused on was different to what I was focused on, right? So they were focused on driving up share price so that the bonus structures would increase and all these types of things, right? Yep. And I was focused on the benefit of the business. Now, both of those things would have got them to the same place, but I never really understood the politics of the place and why I was always sort of, rubbing the wrong way, right, with management. And it took me a little while to get that right. And when I did, eventually I left because I realised that I just wasn't a good fit.
So that's a lesson there, maybe in listening to those alarm bells through the selection or the hiring process.
Yep.
If it doesn't sort of look and smell quite right, it probably isn't.
Yeah, and I went in and tried to change it to something that was, but just found that there was so much inertia. Yeah. It actually got to the point where I started questioning, is this me, right? Is it a me problem, right? But it wasn't actually an organizational problem. It wasn't a management problem. It was a fit problem, right? Yeah. I was trying to be something that they didn't need.
And do you know what, that fit is so important. Yep. There's many people out there with the right technical skills to do most jobs, but if you're not fitting culturally and aligned culturally, and I don't believe necessarily there's ever trying to reflect before I make this statement, but a wrong culture. There probably are some examples of wrong cultures, but it's the wrong fit, and there would always be people that are to the right culture.
There might be a wrong culture for you.
That's right, wrong for you. That's right.
It's wrong for you, but it's not necessarily wrong for the business. It might have been absolutely perfect for the business at the time. Yeah. And if you have a look at their share price, it was growing, and so was the business. They were expanded in New Zealand into Thailand. So they were doing all the right things on paper. It's just that somehow I wasn't meshing. Yeah. Right? The other thing that I should have been aware of but wasn't was that I wasn't directly on the executive there. I was reporting to someone who was. Okay. And I find that a very difficult position to be influential from. All right. Because you've sort of got to almost turn that person into a puppet talking on your behalf. Yeah. And it's a very difficult thing to do in those circumstances.
Well, particularly with tech, because it always looks like a cost center.
Yep.
Unless you're really understanding the way that you can turn that cost into a business benefit, and when you're expecting someone else to translate that vision, that's pretty tough.
And I think on the flip side, if you're not actually sitting at the executive table, then it's very difficult for you to get an understanding of what's really going on in the organisation,
yeah, that's also
as
true.
Opposed to what the words are saying, right? Yeah. And I think that's why it took me so long to actually realise I was in the wrong place. So I was there for not much more than a year, and then eventually moved on.
Yeah, and you had a couple of stops. There was, I think, Air Services, and I saw Icon Water. But I was really interested in the midst of COVID, you joined, I'm not sure how to pronounce it. Is it
AGL?
That's a mouthful, isn't it?
It's ACT, Electricity, Water, AGL. Right?
Oh, right. So there's some logic behind the name.
That's what actually is an acronym for. Right?
How to pronounce the name was a criteria to get the job, I'm assuming. But it was about replacing gas appliances, is my understanding.
No, Actu is Canberra's. Actu actually has another company under it called Evo Energy, and Evo Energy is the poles and wires energy provider and gas provider for the ACT.
Yep.
Right. So it's a monopoly. They run all of the ACT, and Actu AGL. Retail is also the biggest electricity retailer. It used to be the only electricity retailer, and then retail became competitive. But they still hold, I don't know what it is now, but when I was there, around about 70% of the market share in the ACT. So it's basically the energy company in Canberra, gas and electricity. And before that, my pathway into there was I'd done a year of program management for Icon Water, which is a sister business. So they're linked at the hip, financially and through their ownership. So.
Yeah, great. I saw we kind of touched on the role with 100% Project and in the dolphin research as well. But I saw through your resume that kind of non-exec work. There's quite a series of non-exec and advisory roles. Was that kind of mindful that was an area that you wanted to kind of move towards next?
So what I tried to do is after I actually left Bapcor, I decided I was going to be a consultant because that's how you can make money as a consultant, right? Just go in, 3 days, make a lot of money, leave. You don't have to actually have any responsibilities. Sounded like a great thing. But every time I go and do consulting for someone, they'd say, can you hang around and actually see this through to the end? And I was too dumb to say no, right? And so what I ended up doing was ending up, I went in to do some consulting for Icon Water and ended up being there for a year to fix a particular program problem that they had. Yeah. And Actu AGL was sort of that way as well. And Air Services was actually just a pure consulting job, right? Or a contracting type role. But it was a really interesting program of work that they were going to run, which I can talk about if you want to go into the detail. But effectively, very quickly, Air Services does 3 things, not 2. Everyone thinks they do 2, which is basically air traffic control and running the fire services in the airports. But they also control data, all the aeronautical data to do with Australia and its airspace, which is 11% of the surface of the Earth, right? So anything to do with data, everything to do with planes, everything, high buildings, the lot, they've got information on that. And so what the job was that I'd gone in to be the project manager for was to do an uplift of these data services to take them from being effectively something that operated on paper and fax and out of books to be APIs and industry data sharing. And it was a big program, looked really interesting. They had Deloitte in there with a cast of thousands actually doing the work, and I was the program manager. But it got curtailed very quickly by COVID because, sort of similar to Airbnb, the way Air Services makes its money is by clipping the ticket on every flight and every piece of freight coming in and out of an airport in Australia. Right. And when that sort of fell away, so did their revenue. So the program I was running was very important but not particularly urgent. So it got put on the back burner.
There you go. So that's how you've kind of found yourself now more recently in the kind of non-exec world?
Well, I'm actually sort of back in the exec world again now. So so what happened is I spent 2.5 years with Actu AGL, right? Yeah. They needed some assistance up there. After I left Air Services, I sort of walked away from Air Services because I could see that was going to die, and it died. The next week they cancelled that project or put it on hold. But I ended up walking straight into Actu AGL because their CIO had just recently left and they were looking for someone to come in and assist them with some work. It was meant to be a 1-year thing and it turned into a 2.5-year thing during COVID, etc. But again, it was sort of like consulting that turned into a real job. Yeah. And I left that in the middle of 22 because I'd sort of had enough of working in full time, actually. So I came back to Melbourne because I was sort of living up in Canberra. My wife and daughters were down here in Melbourne. And you can imagine over the COVID period, I didn't see them a lot, not because of a problem in the ACT, but getting in and out of Melbourne was a bit tough at the time with all the lockdowns. So I came home to spend a bit of time with the family and actually just to relax, and I sort of went into a semi-retirement thing. But ended up getting dragged into my current role, which is with National Archives, because I was doing a bit of consulting work for them through a woman that worked with me at ActuAGL, who is now working for them, and had asked a few favours, and that turned into a bit of consulting. And then eventually I'm up there now, basically, well, I'm not up there, I'm down here, but working for National Archives as their CIO and taking them through a bit of a digital uplift as well.
Yeah, great. So what would that kind of involve for you over the next few years? What's the project look like with National Archives?
So it's an interesting organisation. So National Archives has been historically a very paper-focused, paper-based organisation. They measure so what they do, for people who don't know, right, is National Archives collects records from all of the Australian government agencies and stores them, right? So, the ones that people are sort of aware of are immigration records and World War II records for soldiers and sailors, etc. But pretty much any record that's created by an agency gets stored away in the archives, and we have boxes and boxes and boxes of stuff. We're not talking a small place here. We have 400 shelf kilometres right of archive boxes, so massive amounts of paper. Now, most of that is sitting in boxes and has been somewhat described, right, but hasn't been released to the public yet. It hasn't been digitized. If people need it, they can go into our office. We can pull them out and show them to them.
Yeah, right.
But the world's changed, right? So National Archives is dealing with the world 20 years ago, because things are handed over from the agencies when they hit their 20-year mark, and then we store them from there on. Sometimes a bit earlier, but 20 years is the typical sort of life. So if you sort of think back 20 years ago, we'd gone through the transition to an electronic world. Documents weren't printed as much anymore. Now their documents are documents. They're a .doc or whatever. And so what we're seeing coming across now are what are called born digital records. So they were never actually on paper, right? They're actually digital, and handling them is much more difficult because you've got to deal with the myriad types of formats that they come in, the fact that every format of every file lasts 5 years until it's superseded by the next one and superseded by the next one after that. And Archive's job is to work out, how do we keep this stuff, right? Where do we keep it? How do we make it available to the public, not just now but in 100 years time? How do you take that WordPerfect file from 1987 and make it available in 2147, right? So we're doing a lot of work on both doing a digital uplift on the way that we operate internally, but also looking at our platforms and services and how do we actually set them up for the future. So there's a lot of stuff in there.
I did read somewhere a few years ago, they were saying there's already code that's obsolete, that almost people can't use, or because time's moved on in 30 years or whatever since it's been written, and to go back and to figure that out is probably too hard.
And it's obsolescence is our biggest enemy, right? Because things become obsolete very quickly now.
You kind of assume, back you go back hundreds of years, thousands of years in history, a lot was being recorded, so there's not a lot to kind of survive to hang around today. But so everything's now being recorded, but potentially it doesn't mean it's going to be useful in 100, 200 years unless somebody does something about it.
Yeah, and you've also got that, a way to describe it is people have great attic finds. They go up in the attic and they find an old chest and it's full of photo albums and things, diaries and things left over from their great-grandparents or whatever. Right, but there are no electronic attic finds, right? No one's going to go up there in 100 years and find a USB stick and go, well, look at all these photos. They'll go, what the hell's this thing? Throw it in the bin, because they will have no way to read a USB stick in 100 years. Right? So what we've got to do is make sure that level of obsolescence doesn't actually carry across into the National Archives, because those archives are actually the memory of the nation. right?
Yeah, that's right. That's right. Yep. It's a big attic.
Yeah.
It's. I've actually got old cassettes, reel-to-reel cassettes, and so forth in a box in the garage, and I think
Super 8 videos.
That's right. How do I get those out and do anything with them? But interesting. Hey, look, so we're going to move to the. I'm going to do the lightning round with you now. So I'm going to put these cards out here. I'm going to ask you to pick 3 at random.
3 at random.
Yeah, just pick 3 at random.
1, 2, 3. There you go.
And then flip them over, read the card, and tell us your answer.
Okay. What have we got? Lightning round. What are the first 3 things you check when you start your day? That's a good question. Probably email, Teams, and the news in that order.
Okay. What's your go-to news channel?
The Age.
Yeah.
Right. Typically, I'll go and read The Age, only because I'm been subscribed to it forever, and that way I don't have to worry about whether I can read it or not. Yep.
Cool.
Okay. What does work-life balance mean to you? Well, it's interesting. I don't think there's such a... work-life balance used to mean, I think, how do you actually drive a wedge between work and life, and how do you jump that gap every day in a useful way? And I don't think work-life balance that way works very well. I think work-life balance is about how do you actually make sure that the things that you're doing in your life blend seamlessly so that you don't feel like I'm doing something now that I hate and and I can't wait until 5 o'clock when I can do something I love. Yeah. I think if you're in that type of circumstance, you're probably in the wrong work because you only have one life, right? So if you're spending 8 hours a day of it doing work that you don't like, then try and find something that you do like, right?
That's a good start point.
Because it is your life. It's still your life while you're at work. So really work-life balance is about trying to find something that keeps you energized regardless of what particular time of the day it is. Right? And that also means, making sure that your family life is pretty sound and you're actually interacting with them as well, and that you're finding a bit of downtime occasionally, and that you've got something that you can do by yourself occasionally, because you'll find yourself by yourself often,
Yes,
you want to make sure that you actually enjoy your own company as well.
Absolutely. It's interesting. I came into the world of work before technology was really established. I sort of joked with the team about getting my first email address and sending my first emails and phoning the person and saying, did you get it? But the world of work back then, you'd go to an office or place of work, you'd work till 5 o'clock, whatever time, 5:30, turn off your computer, get in the car and you'd go home. And you wouldn't think about work. You wouldn't interact with work until you came back to the office the next day. So I kind of make an argument we had better work-home balance before technology came in like a bulldozer and meant that I can sit on the couch at 10 o'clock at night and get a Teams message and check my emails and all the other things. So I think there's a lot of work to do with how we use technology to actually give us the advantage of work-home balance, whereas I feel that it's probably disrupted a lot of that.
Yeah, and I think
unintentionally, by the way.
I think there's some new laws about to come home, which are basically the right to switch off.
Yeah,
I think they kick in at the end of this month.
That's right,
roundabout, right? And I think those are great laws. But if you haven't already worked out how to build that into your work-life balance, then you shouldn't be reliant on a law to actually get you into the right place. You can use that as leverage against a horrible boss who keeps interrupting you at midnight, but the law here is an expression of what should have been happening in your life for a very long period of time.
I think in that instance, it's the law of common sense. Yeah. But last one.
Coffee or tea? Definitely tea. I used to drink massive amounts of coffee in my life, and then one day I realized I hated it, and I've never drank it since. So now I drink massive amounts of tea in my life.
What's your favorite tea?
The cheapest possible one. Lipton's, Bushels, that type of stuff. Yeah. I hate all the really highfalutin teas. You take them out and they take forever to diffuse, and they're sort of very dainty and everything else, but they have no flavor to them. I like tea that strips paint. Really strong.
We call it in England. I don't know if you call it that in Australia.
Billy tea, that type of stuff. Stronger the better.
Yeah, fantastic.
Yep.
I've got a couple of questions I'd like to kind of add in a similar vein. What are you most proud of in your career?
Probably the fact that I've managed to make a change to a lot of the way that companies work but I've done it through elevating the people around me, right? Not through what I thought, right? Yeah. I think if people go in thinking I was the smartest guy in the room, or I want to be the smartest guy in the room, right? You're probably in the wrong room, because you really want to have really smart people around you, because if you can actually get the really smart people to buy into your ideas and treat them like their own and push ahead, then you can be so much more impactful in what you do than just trying to do it yourself. So I think, making sure that I sort of took people along on the journey and got people interested in what they were doing, I think that's probably what I'm most proud of.
Yeah, it's great. It kind of takes me back to your comment very early on about the role at the UN, where you had an incredibly team of smart people. I think the Zimbabwean you mentioned there was one of the smartest people you worked with, and your job was to coordinate and bring that group together. I think as a leader, if you've got that around you, half the job's done.
Well, I think there's also a point with the sort of further you go into your leadership journey, the less you become the expert in anything, right? Yeah. You just can't hold on to that much knowledge, and you haven't got the time to invest in trying to maintain it.
Well, your expertise is leadership, and impactful leadership at that point.
That's right. So you've got to allow other people to be really good at what they do and celebrate that. The trick, I suppose, is really to get them to is to put out there the goals and the ambitions that you have in such a way that it makes them excited to be part of that, right?
Yes.
That's, and it's even better if you can get them to think it was their idea. And often it is, because they are the smartest people in the room.
Do you have any career regrets?
Probably a few. I think, the jump to Bapcor probably wasn't the smartest thing that I've ever done. Looking back on it, that was, but it's a regret, but it's not a regret that I'm going to sit down and cry about, because I learned a lot from the experience. So I think, bottom line is I've learned from every experience I've had. I've probably got a lot of regrets about, the way I've treated certain people earlier in my life. Some of the decisions I've made probably haven't been the smartest decisions, but they were decisions and I own them, so you've got to own the decisions that you make and the way you've been, because they shape who you are now.
Talking of shaping, it kind of leads nicely to my next question. We're kind of shaped by the feedback that we receive. Has there been a sort of singular piece of feedback that's really been significant to you in your career?
It's a good question. And nothing comes to mind. There's probably been lots of feedback. I think negative feedback, or let's call it constructive feedback.
Hopefully it was intended that way.
Is probably actually what's been most impactful for me, because you can fall into a groove where you sort of think, I'm doing really well here, and then suddenly you get blindsided by you're not doing that well at all. Here's the gaps that you're leaving all over the place, or the carnage that you're leaving in your wake. And I think that type of feedback is, at the time it's hard to take, but it's the most impactful feedback, because it's the thing that's likely to make you change your approach to things. Positive feedback is just going to makes you all chuffed and everything else. But at the end of the day, it doesn't make any difference to the way you are, right? And in fact, all it does is reinforce your habits, whether they're good or bad. But having someone actually point out some of the things that you're doing that could be improved, I think, is the best thing you can possibly do.
Absolutely. I think we all need that mirror sometimes. And sometimes you can do it for yourself, but other times, more often than not, somebody else doing it for you is greater impact.
Yep.
If you had a singular piece of sage advice that you wanted to pass on to the next generation of technologists, what would it be? You're going to have three aspects to every business that you walk into, right? There's going to be the technology, there's going to be the processes that the business runs, and there's going to be the people who use the technology to run those processes. The thing that is most important in that triangle is the people. So whilst you can focus on the technology all you want, if you're not actually paying attention to what the people want, what the people need, how they're feeling, what they're saying, what they're doing, how you're impacting them and influencing them, then you're going to get nowhere, right? It's very hard to initiate change or to lift performance by focusing on the technology or just focusing on the process. You've got to take the people along for the journey, and to do that,
You've really got to get them to understand not what needs to be done or how it's going to be done, but why it has to be done.
Yeah.
Right. To get them to not just understand the why, but to believe the why. You've got to sell the purpose.
Yeah, fantastic. Thank you. My last question is sort of what are you reading, or what have you read? Book recommendation, or where do you kind of go for sources of inspiration in terms of your development?
Yep. So I probably used to read a lot of sort of what you might call, self-help or development type books in the past, but I tend not to do that now. I try to switch off by reading novels. Sometimes historical. I just read Peter Fitzsimon's book on Breaker Morant, which was fantastic. I mean, It was written a long time ago, but I've just managed to get to it. Absolutely fantastic. But I like sci-fi novels, wistful things that sort of take you out of your headspace, And if I'm actually trying to work out how something works in the technology space these days, I found there is no better teaching tool than YouTube. Right? There are some nupties on YouTube, but there are some really, really good resources on there. And people spend enormous amounts of time putting things up there for free. Right? It is just incredible, really, the amount of information you can get on there. When I was a kid, I used to be a bit of a nerd, and I used to read these little young people's science encyclopedias at night in bed, You can't read the internet in bed because it's not laid out like that, but you can certainly use something like YouTube, to drill down into subject matter.
Yeah, fantastic. We're actually talking about that today about the podcast. We're talking about sort of learning different ways to edit and sort of develop, and just immersing ourselves in some of the experts in these things that will take the time to post a video to explain how to do it. And the learning is probably much quicker, faster than going off to mainstream education to try and figure out how to get a certificate in it.
Most definitely. In fact, I think education is going to undergo some major changes in the next 20 years. No one wants to go to uni for 4 years and to do the boring parts. They just want to learn the bit they need for the job. I think somewhere along the line, university stopped being a vocational thing and started becoming more of an institutional. What's the old joke? Marriage is an institution, but no one wants to live in an institution. Universities are the same, right? And I think the reason you go to university is to get the skills to be able to go and do a job, but you need sort of vocational skills for that. So I think what's going to end up happening is it's going to break down into smaller, sharper courses that you stitch together specifically for the thing that you're interested in. But anyway, that'll be interesting to see if that pans out.
Yeah, absolutely.
There'll be some resistance to it, I'm sure.
Look, thank you so much for your time today. It's been really insightful, really interesting, a really different journey to others that we've explored. And you've been really generous with sharing that with us. So thank you.
Yeah, it's been a pleasure. Thanks.
Cheers.
Bye.
Thank you for listening to Tales from Tech Titans, and be sure to follow us wherever you get your podcast. If you'd like to get more insights about tech careers, then check out the Emmbr, that's Emmbr LinkedIn page for the latest updates, articles, and engaging discussions.